Well, here we are in the last learning module of the class. This one's about East Asian religion and philosophy. Let's start with some definitions. The distinction between religion and philosophy is a problematic one, especially when these terms are applied to East Asian traditions. Regardless of the definition of these terms that you use, all East Asian traditions have elements of what Western scholars would call religion and philosophy. We don't have the time in this class to address this complicated issue, so for our purposes, we will focus on the concrete process of gathering information about each of the main traditions. What are those main traditions? We're going to be looking at Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Shintoism, not necessarily in that order. Time constraints for us also mean that we'll focus on the four main traditions that have historically dominated Japanese thought. That's what you see on the screen. So there are some things that we won't be looking at. Western imports such as Christianity and Islam will not be addressed here, though they are certainly there are certainly bibliographic resources on them. They are certainly extant in Japan, but we just don't have time to look at that. Nor will what is called popular religion or new religion be discussed in this unit. We already have enough on our plate. So whose tradition are we talking about here anyway? I really did mean to write East Asia on that title slide and not Japan, because it's important to realize that although China was central in the development of many of these traditions, the main exception in our case for Japanese studies being Shinto, these traditions became the common property of all the national cultures that we've been looking at. So we've got China in the middle, and then you can see in this case a proliferation of Buddhism. It spreads out across. It starts in India, it goes across China, it ends up in Japan. Japanese scholars of Buddhism were very influenced by Chinese scholars of Buddhism. But the point here is that people in East Asia have taken these traditions and entirely incorporated them in their own culture. Or we might say they've assimilated them into their own culture. So Japanese don't think of Buddhism as a foreign religion, for example. Here's another image. I like this map because it kind of shows the different aspects of Chinese tradition spreading out across the rest of East Asia. So it's not just the traditions of Buddhism, for example, but as we've discussed in earlier learning modules, the civil service exam system, the ranking system, of course, other major ideas, printing, the use of Chinese characters, and then eventually the use of those characters to morph into kana, and that goes along with, I say that's printing and the writing system, but printing as in movable type. All these influences spread out from China, but then become assimilated in their homeland. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today will reference back to China, but that's not because the Japanese, as I was saying earlier, view these traditions as imports, but rather we have to understand what the origins are in order to understand what these traditions become once they're rooted in Japan. Here's another example. Outside of Buddhism, in the case of Confucianism, Japanese scholars wrote and debated philosophical ideas in Confucian thought, particularly during the Tokugawa period, as I'll mention later, without the slightest sense that they were somehow foreign. So over the centuries, they became, let's call them common property. Now, I'm going to digress here for just a moment and talk about language. There's a lot of material, particularly associated with Buddhism, available, and it's not all going to be in Japanese or in Chinese. Linguistically, the primary texts of all these East Asian philosophies differ a little, and they may not be what you would expect. Confucian and Taoist texts are usually in classical Chinese, which the Japanese were pretty facile with. Buddhist texts will be, it's a real toss-up, in a collection of languages, maybe classical Chinese, maybe Sanskrit, maybe Pali. If you've never heard of Pali, it's not P-O-L-L-Y, it's P-A-L-I, as you see spelled there on your screen. Really, studying Buddhist texts is a linguistic challenge because so many important texts come to us in different linguistic forms. It's not all one particular form. And Shinto texts will either be in classical Japanese or in the early form of Japanese writing that we see in the Kojiki. We've looked at that before. We'll look at it again. So a lot of the learning modules that we have done this semester have focused on English language resources and Japanese language resources. But once we get into the traditions as we are today, then we really have to kind of open the doors a little bit more widely and accept that these texts are going to be in multiple languages. Let me just digress even a little bit further here and show you some visual aids. Here's a page of the Diamond Sutra in classical Chinese. For the longest time, the Japanese scholars of Buddhism dealt with it through classical Chinese. Because Buddhism had come through China to Japan, the scholars assumed in a way that that was a normal form of the text. They weren't concerned with the fact that the sutra were actually translations from earlier languages from the subcontinent. So if you're going to do any serious Buddhist studies, one of the things you have to learn is classical Chinese. Here's an example of what Sanskrit looks like. Okay, these are not related languages, classical Chinese and Sanskrit. You got a different writing system, different language family. This is not an easy transition to make. And of course, here's what the opening of the Kojiki looks like. We've seen this before, and in its original form, it was what we see here on the left-hand side of the screen, this kind of odd mix of classical Chinese and some Manyogana thrown in there. Certainly not an easy text to work with. And Sogdian was the last one that was on the previous screen. In case you don't know where Sogdia is, I have a map here, so you can see the little pink shaded area is where Sogdia was located in ancient times, and here's what Sogdian looks like. Again, not something that looks like a language you could just pick up if you were already fluent in Japanese and classical Chinese. This is a whole nother language to learn, and yet there are many influential texts that are written in this language. And so if you're working with Buddhist texts, it's going to be a long haul. Let's put it that way. All right, so I'm gonna leave that world behind. I'm not going to expect you to learn all these languages, but I am going to come back to that topic of language in a minute. I want to start with some general reference works to recommend some general reference works. It is possible to get general information on East Asian traditions and these general reference works provide that information, I think, in a better way than, say, a bigger general encyclopedia or Wikipedia or something like that might. These works also allow you to get some specifics on particular aspects of these East Asian traditions. The Encyclopedia of Religion and the Encyclopedia of Eastern Philosophy and Religion are both in the reference section of the SUNY Albany Library and probably in the reference section of just about any four-year campus in the SUNY system, I would expect. These are tried and true tools in the toolbox, if you will, of the study of traditions. All right, the language of most of the primary philosophical texts, as I'm going to demonstrate, makes translation really difficult. You know, translating, say, the instruction manual for a digital camera is one thing, but translating a philosophical text is a whole nother ball of wax. And it's sad to say that any serious study, any really, really detailed study of these texts eventually must work with the original language. So Although I wouldn't expect you as an undergraduate to blithely go off and access these texts in the original language today, in future, if you pursued any of these traditions at the graduate level or beyond, then familiarity with the texts would be really important. And it's probably at this point that some of you are sitting there and rolling your eyes as you listen to the video on your computer, thinking, oh, yeah, we got it, you got it. She's told us a million times how important the language is. Can we just move on? In this case, in the case of the traditions, I want to push this just a little bit further, okay, so that you understand why I'm putting such importance on this, okay? As a sample, I'm going to use the opening passage to the Taoist classic, the Tao Te Ching, which I'll be talking a little bit more about later on. So let's look at the first line of the Tao Te Ching. This is notoriously difficult to translate. Now, it's in classical Chinese, so that already makes things kind of difficult. But let me try and lead you through, hold your hand here. We've got this character is Tao, as in Taoism, okay? This one is, in Japanese it's pronounced ka, in Chinese it's ke, and it means something that's possible, okay? Here we have hijou, as in hijou ni, something that's outside of the ordinary. And then we have Taoism again, right? This one is name, like namai no na. And then we have that one again, the possibility one, name, and exception and name. Okay, there it is, the beginning of the Tao Te Ching. How are we going to translate that? Let me show you how 5 different people have translated it. We'll start with this. The Tao, or the way, that can be told of is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Okay. I don't know where the eternal part comes from, but it's sort of commentary, filling in the blanks. English is a very demanding language. It likes to have articles and subjects and verbs and all that. Let's look at another one. Even the finest teaching is not the Tao itself. Even the finest name is insufficient to define it. Okay. How about a third one? The way that can be experienced is not true. The world that can be constructed is not real. Doesn't really seem to have names in there, but if you're approaching it from a slightly different epistemological direction, maybe you could see that connection. There are ways, but the way is uncharted. There are names, but not nature, in words. And last but not least, the Tao that can be trodden is not the enduring and unchanging Tao. The name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. Now, those 5 translations are remarkably different, but they're all translations of that line that we see across the top in red. So, a lot of the texts in traditions are, in a way, purposely vague. And are open to all kinds of interpretations, not just translators, but even native speakers might interpret these texts differently. Indeed, there are lots of treatises on the classics in Chinese, for example, and so those folks are working in the same language that the original text is in, but they still add lots and lots and lots of commentary. So for the most part, the rest of what we're going to be looking at today are our translations of these things. And I do that as sort of conciliation to the fact that, okay, you're undergraduates and you can't be working with these texts in the original. But now you know why that's still problematic. So let me start with where to find some of these materials. Whenever you're doing a research project on philosophy, religion, intellectual history, you should be sure to include some analysis of the primary sources. Just because you can't read them in the original, you should still be considering them. So at this stage, you'll probably be limited to translation. There are several venerable anthologies of translations of East Asian philosophical or religious texts. that can serve as first stops in collecting primary sources, much more efficient first stops than, say, Wikipedia. Although some have been in service for decades, like the one that you see on your screen here, they're still very useful. In Japanese studies, I still recommend sources of Japanese tradition. I mentioned that once in an earlier learning module, and I'd like to bring it back and put it on the table again. Here, where it says Japanese tradition, most of this book really falls into this genre of religion or philosophy. And to give you just kind of a quick feel of what you'd find if you bought this book, here's the beginning of the table of contents. So it starts off with the earliest records of Japan that are actually written by Chinese emissaries. And then the earliest chronicles of Japan, those are from the early mythologies. And then we move into early Shinto, Prince Shotoku and his constitution, which is largely influenced by Buddhism and by Confucianism. If we flip the page, we see Chinese thought and institutions in early Japan, Nara Buddhism, Saicho, who was a major Tendai Buddhist leader, and Mount Hiei, Kukai, who was a major leader in esoteric Buddhism, and some of the things that he wrote. So a source book can really help you very quickly get your hands on and you wrap your brain around the seminal important texts for all of these traditions in Japan. So again, although I didn't require this text for this class, I really strongly recommend it. You can find cheap used copies on the internet. Okay, so that's one example. There's two other books that I'd like to mention. One is Donald Lopez's Buddhism in Practice, and the other is George Tanabe's Religions of Japanese in Practice. Princeton University has been in the process of publishing this set of anthologies of translations with introductions of interesting texts in various world religious traditions, not just East Asia. They're particularly concerned with how religions are practiced rather than religious doctrine per se, so that these are different from, say, just picking up the translation of a sutra. The texts that they selected aren't necessarily the most famous, but they do give a sense of the variety of sources associated with the subject of the volume. So these are also books that I would recommend and certainly are most likely in your library. Okay, so let's start with Shintoism. What are the major texts here? This is probably the shortest and sweetest section of today's lecture. Depends on how you define sweet. The Shinto tradition is a religious system indigenous to Japan. It originates in Japan. And more interesting perhaps is that it never leaves Japan, and it doesn't go off and take hold beyond the Japanese archipelago. So it's that indigenous native tradition. The importation of Confucian and Buddhist philosophies necessarily influenced Shinto. It couldn't live in a vacuum, but it nevertheless retained its distinctive features. So Shinto beliefs focus on spirits and deities that inhabit the natural world, and the word for that in Japanese is kami, which is this kanji right here. So Shinto means the way of the kami. And as I've mentioned before, the earliest sources for Shinto beliefs are these two 8th century historical texts, the Kojiki and the Nihongi or Nihon Shoki. The problem is that these texts are not designed to be pillars of a tradition. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But in any case, we've already seen these Shinto texts. These are mythologies. The opening passage looks like this, with the genealogy of the imperial family going back to the age of the gods, right? Okay. Well enough. However, really sincerely systematic approaches to Shintoism don't really date until you get into the Tokugawa period. Most notably, the work of Motori Norinaga is important, and here is a postage stamp dedicated to Motori Norinaga. You see he lived 1730 to 1801. Motori wrote a number of treatises on the gods and also on the Japanese language. He was one of the, in essence, one of the founding fathers of Kokugaku, of national learning. And he's credited with being the first scholar to attempt to define what a kami is. So prior to the Tokugawa period, Shintoism is this very loose set of beliefs. It doesn't really have what I would recognize as a central figure. I mean, some people might argue that the emperor is that central figure, but I think that's a little bit of a stretch, right? There isn't a seminal text that defines metaphysically what's going on in the world, whereas in the case of Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, they're much more developed, much more systematic traditions. But the Shinto tradition is this, as I was saying, very loose mix, and it can actually differ. You know, certain beliefs and ideas will differ from one region to the next. And so it's not until the Tokugawa period that scholars sit down and say, you know, let's approach this from a scholarly standpoint. Okay, so here is Motori Norinaga's definition of kami. This is often called the three-cornered or three-part definition. And this is from a work that he wrote called the Kojiki-den. Speaking in general, it may be said that kami signifies, in the first place, the deities of heaven and earth that appear in the ancient records, and also the spirits of the shrines where they are worshipped. It is hardly necessary to say that it includes human beings. Yet he found it necessary to say that. It also includes such things as birds, beasts, trees, plants, seas, mountains, and so forth. Anything whatsoever which was outside of the ordinary, which possessed superior power, or which was awe-inspiring, was called kami. So those are the three parts, okay? Outside of the ordinary, possessing superior power, or is awe-inspiring. And this is not an and. This is an or. So anything that meets these descriptions is consequently a kami. And as kind of vague as that may seem to you, it was groundbreaking for Norinaga to have produced that text. So if you're interested in the Shinto tradition, a good place to look for that information is in Sources of Japanese Tradition, where they've translated some of Motori Norinaga's works. Before I move on to Buddhism, which is the next tradition, I also want to point out that this lack of coherency in terms of it being a scholarly endeavor as a tradition is one of the reasons that Shinto is not a research topic that I recommend to my students. Kind of this in-joke amongst the faculty of Japanese studies. You always say, students are choosing research topics, and yeah, I got the student who came to me and says they want to do a paper on Shinto, and we kind of snort and say, yeah, good luck with that. And the reason we say that is that there isn't a lot of material out there. There's even less material out there in English. It grows a little bit every year, but there's just not that much there. And then to sort of add insult to injury, our library doesn't have particularly much of it. So this is still, in a way, a nascent field. Okay, let's move on. We'll move on to Buddhism. Even more than Confucianism and Taoism, Buddhism is an international and multicultural tradition. With its roots in northern India, it's spread throughout South, Central, East, and Southeast Asia, as you can see on this map. It almost looks like a weather map because the arrows are going in so many different directions. In the past century or so, it's even begun to mature in Europe and the United States. Hollywood actors are really fond of Buddhism, for example. There are copious materials available for researching Buddhist thought and practice. These materials were written in a very large number of languages, which we've just been sort of looking at very briefly. But thankfully, translation has always been a valued activity in Buddhist scholarship, and so that commitment continues. And consequently, more and more works are appearing in English. So although you still have to take everything that you read in a way with a grain of salt in translation, it's a much more sophisticated realm in the Buddhist tradition than than, for example, you might find in Shintoism or something like that. Let's start with some dictionaries and some reference works. There's some really good Japanese dictionaries, in this case the Bukkyo Daijiten. If you don't want to work with Japanese language, you could use the Historical Dictionary of Buddhism. Soothill's dictionary is an old standard. It's been republished and republished and republished. It's now actually in public domain, so a lot of publishers have been reissuing it because they don't have to pay copyright on it anymore. So we often refer to it just as Soothill because Soothill was the original author of it. And outside of the realm of paper, ink and paper, and into the realm of the internet, I want to recommend the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism. This is an online resource, and it is free to some extent. I'll show you to use for visitors, and it is a fairly comprehensive work. Let's take a look at it. Here's what the main page looks like. It's not super pretty. It's kind of like Jim Breen, but just like Jim Breen, it's authoritative. It's got a lot of information. So when you first come to the page, you see there's a search box, and we'll play with that in just a minute. And there's different ways that you can search. You can also search by radical, and this goes according to the Kangxi radical system. You can search by total number of strokes, which you don't really want to do unless you're desperate, okay? And then there's some other ways that you can search. They also have some external links here to other texts and databases. So what happens if we're going to do a search? Well, I have typed in Myoho here, and I'm going to search that. Now, when you use this dictionary, you can do it as a guest. You'll always get this security window. And if you forget what I'm about to tell you, you can go through the Access Policies link and find out about it again. But they limit you to looking up 10 definitions a day within a 24-hour period. For most students, that's not a problem. So for the username, I'm in the wrong language. Let me switch over to English here for just a second. For the username, you type guest, and for the password, you also type guest. So here are the results for my search. I had typed in Myoho, and it says here are the head word matches. In other words, Myoho appears in the top entry of that section. Okay, and then they give lots of different links to connections to Myoho. So the dictionary of a digital dictionary of Buddhism largely takes Soothill and then has added to it. It's being updated constantly. It has other features, but I think they're a little bit more complicated than we need to look at for the purposes of this course. If you get more serious about Buddhist studies, I would encourage you to play around with it a little bit further. So those are just dictionaries and reference works. Now I want to talk a little bit more also about more specific texts. I'll get into sutra in just a minute. To try and give you a roadmap, though, of where we are with Buddhism, because Buddhism is an awfully big topic. I want to give you a quick summary of what Buddhism means in the context of Japanese studies. So I'm now going to ignore China and Southeast Asia and India and all that, okay? We're just going to look at some of the basics. This is sort of the basic family tree of Buddhism in Japan. So I have this kind of false monolithic entity of Buddhism here. Buddhism splits into two major branches, the Mahayana and the Hinayana branches. Now, Hinayana is still alive and well in the world, but not in Japan. So I wrote here that there are 3 early schools in Japan, part of the 6 schools of Nara Buddhism that belong to Hinayana, but they remain academic, and then that's all that happens to them. People don't become followers of Hinayana Buddhism in the Japanese context. So when we're talking about Japanese Buddhism, we can pretty much just ignore Hinayana. Everything that we're looking at, everything that we're concerned with is Mahayana. Now, I also admit that I'm only giving you the most basics here. I'm not going to be giving you subsects or anything like that. So here we are with Mahayana in Japan. And then from that, this line is it shouldn't be double. It should just be a solid line. We have Tendai, Shingon, Zen, Pure Land, and then I'm probably going to make a lot of people really angry by including this here, and Nichiren. There are many people that claim that Nichiren isn't really Buddhism, but I'm trying to simplify things as much as I can, so I'm going to throw it in there. I wanted to give you these 5 different names so that you'd be at least remotely familiar with them. If you hear these terms in your studies, you can say to yourself, oh, that's one of those groups of Mahayana Buddhism in Japan. So let's go through each one in that order, and I'll just give you a real quick summary of what they are. So we'll start with Tendai. Tendai is a school of Buddhism that developed in China with a markedly scholastic approach. It's often called sort of scholastic Buddhism or academic Buddhism or something like that. Among other activities, it's known for its attempt to systematically catalog all Buddhist teachings and explain their relationship to ultimate truth. It later spread, obviously, to Japan out of China and became an important part of the Japanese Buddhist establishment. Here on our screen, we have important figures in Tendai Buddhism, and the one in particular that I'd like to point out is Saicho. Saicho is usually seen as the founder of Tendai Buddhism in Japan. And if you have visited Kyoto and you've gone to Mount Hiei, you know that the temple complex on Mount Hiei was founded by Saicho. So that's a Tendai temple complex. The next category, next group, is Shingon. Shingon is also known as esoteric Buddhism, and it's concerned with the ritual and meditative practices leading to enlightenment. What do I mean by ritual and meditative practices? The practice of looking at a mandala, which we have here. Okay, a picture of a mandala, which is essentially, it's often a painting. It can be three-dimensional too, but it's a map that one uses to meditate. Or the use here of a mudra. A mudra is, and there are many of them, this is just one example, a form that your hands can take, and it's also seen as a meditation aid. The third one that I didn't mention is a mantra, words that are repeated, also as a meditation aid. So Shingon is kind of mysterious. That's why it's called esoteric Buddhism, and it focuses on these methods of transmission, and it teaches that Buddhahood can be attained in this lifetime by anyone. Zen Buddhism is probably one of the most well-known sects of Mahayana Buddhism. Because of the efforts of a number of East Asian and Western practitioners, this school has spread to Europe and the United States, and it continues to develop in both of those places. Zen emphasizes the importance of meditation, and indeed that term Zen or Chan in Chinese means concentration or meditation. And what it de-emphasizes is scholastic activity. So it's sort of like the anti-Tendai in that respect. So Tendai is really focused on texts and this academic approach to enlightenment, and Zen leaves texts and even things like mandala and mudra and mantra behind, and advocates that enlightenment is reached not through a scholarly approach, but rather a markedly non-scholarly approach. And Pure Land Buddhism. Although Pure Land is commonly described as popular Buddhism because its emphasis is on faith in the saving power of Amida Buddha or Amitabha Buddha, which we see here on the slide, this was nevertheless a very important and remains a very important version of Buddhism. And it has historically been developed by very sophisticated scholars. Pure Land Buddhism still accounts for, I think, I'm not sure off the top of my head what the numbers are, but I think it is a majority of Buddhists in Japan. And now we come to the heretical category, Nichiren Buddhism. This type of Buddhism originates in Japan, and this is one of the reasons why people think, oh, it can't really be legitimate because it originates there, and it's still largely confined to Japan. It's particularly devoted to the Lotus Sutra. This school has advocated in the past, a more nationalistic brand of Buddhism. That's another reason why it's very controversial. It's seen as nationalistic, and of course, if you're concerned about nationalism in the early 20th century, then Nichiren Buddhism seemed kind of almost suspect. Many of the writings of its founder, Nichiren, whose portrait is here on the slide, have been translated. They have a tremendous outreach program. And so they'll send out translations of Nichiren texts for free all over the world. So those are the branches of Buddhism that we hear about in Japan. Now I want to leave Japan behind for a moment and kind of go back to the crucible here, to the beginning of Buddhism. I'll leave that split between Mahayana and Hinayana apart and start talking about major texts. There are many types of Buddhist texts, many. The canonical texts, more technically known as the Tripitaka, as you see it spelled there, Tripitaka. They're known as the Tripitaka, and the Tripitaka means the three baskets. These are traditionally divided into three types: sermons of the Buddha, the Sutra; sources on monastic discipline, the Vinaya; and scholastic treatises, the Abhidharma. Many other kinds of texts, however, are available and have been included in ever larger compilations of Buddhist texts. Such texts include histories of Buddhism, collections of biographies of eminent monks, prayers, ritual texts, etc. There's a huge canon out there. Okay, so I can't tell you what the canon says, don't have time, but I am going to try and tell you what the canon is, I suppose, and also some resources for accessing it. So you should be familiar with that term Tripitaka, and particularly familiar with the term sutra. Sutra are the most prominent, if you will, texts of the Tripitaka, the ones that I think students are most likely to read about and read themselves in translation. Now I also want to point out that you can consult this list of important sutra in Japanese Buddhism, and it really is focused on Japanese Buddhism, that appears in the Princeton Companion to Classical Japanese Literature, and it starts as a long list and starts on page 378. It's a super handy list also because, as you can see here on this slide, it gives you the Sanskrit names with the Japanese from the Chinese, all those names for each sutra. So a big problem with the sutras in a way is that you might know what's called in English, it's the Heart Sutra or the Lotus Sutra, but you don't know what the Japanese for that is, or you don't know what the Sanskrit is, or you know the Sanskrit but you don't know what the Japanese is, and on and on and on, right? So the first thing that Minor gives you in the Princeton Companion is this finding list with cross-references between the Sanskrit and the Japanese, and then over the subsequent, I think it's about 10 pages, gives you much more detail about each one of these texts. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is a list of texts that are particularly important for the study of Buddhism in Japan as opposed to China. So let's look just really briefly at some recommended titles of translations of sutra. We'll start with the big name, the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is probably the most important text in East Asian Buddhism, and there are a number of translations available. Here are two, Burton Watson's The Lotus Sutra, and then there's also Scripture of the Lotus Blossom of the Fine Dharma. This is one of those texts that I think will just continue to be translated. Nobody will ever be perfectly happy with one person's translation, and they'll just keep coming up with another one. The Platform Sutra is a key text in the development of Zen Buddhism. So if you're interested in Zen, you might want to check out Jan Polsky's translation. The Vimalakirti Sutra has been very popular in East Asia, not least for its portrayal of the possibility of spiritual attainment by a layman. In other words, you don't have to be real important and royal in order to gain enlightenment. The Wisdom Sutra is associated with the wisdom tradition within Buddhism. That's a technical term. And had a very large impact on East Asian Buddhism. Okay, so I'm not really doing it justice, but we need to move on to Taoism. All right, Taoism is an extremely complex tradition. It is common to distinguish between two broad varieties of Taoism. First is philosophical Taoism. And this developed from the 6th century BC in China and emphasized individual understanding of the cosmic process and spontaneity. You can find any number of charts like this that go along with that. What's the other kind? The other kind is religious Taoism. This integrated the philosophical approach with ideas from folk religion and practices associated with the search for immortality, like alchemy. All right, that's the more fun aspect, but I suppose a little less scholarly aspect of Taoism. What are the texts, the major texts of Taoism? Well, there are two. There's the Tao Te Ching. We were looking at the opening passage of that earlier on. And there's also Zhuangzi. Sometimes people say the Zhuangzi. The Tao Te Ching is reputedly the most translated Chinese text. You have a lot of choices if you're looking for a translation, as we were kind of seeing earlier. But the text is notoriously difficult to pin down in another language, so it will probably continue to be the most translated Chinese text. For our purposes, in a way, we can just, we can put Buddhism up on a shelf and kind of leave it there. And the reason I say that is that it's not so influential in Japan, tremendously influential in China, originates in China, but it's not so influential in Japan. Taoist ideas do appear in such works as The Tales of Times Now Past, Konjaku Monogatari, but the Japanese popular interpretation of Taoist ideas was, in my opinion, not very sophisticated. So if you look at those passages from The Tales of Times Now Past, and they're essentially interpretations of Taoism, and then you look at the original Taoist text, you see that the authors of The Tales of Times Now Past kind of missed some important points, okay? And culturally, Taoism really isn't all that influential in Japan either. I did feel like it needed to be mentioned. I didn't want to just leave it behind, and just let you know what the major texts are. So now I want to move on to our last tradition, which is tremendously influential in Japan, more so than I think most people realize, and that is Confucianism. The Confucian tradition originates in China. It's named for its great expounder, the Master Kong. Confucius is his Latinized name. They say Kong, and then it goes into Confucianism, Confucius. He lived 551 to 479 BC. Confucius was acknowledged throughout East Asia as a sage, as a wise man. And the main elements of his thought provided fruitful ground for further philosophical speculation that continues into the present day. He is remarkably influential across all of East Asia. So what are the major texts of Confucianism? Well, there's what they call the 5 classics. There have been a number of groupings of these classics. So that word classic here is the same character, the same kanji that is used to indicate a sutra. It's a little bit confusing in a way. So you might look at this and think, oh, it's 5 sutra. No, it's not 5. It's 5 classics. Okay. All right. So these classics have been there have been a number of groupings. Tradition has it that Confucius wrote or edited the earliest set of the classics, and those are known as the 6 classics. Actually, one was lost. And so now we refer them as a five classics, but originally there were six. The one that was lost was the classic of music, in case you were wondering. We know it existed because people refer to it, but we have no remaining text of it. We don't know what it contained. So we speak of the five classics, and I'm going to, on subsequent slides, break each one of these down and give you a couple examples from, not all of them, but two of them. So I'm going to start with the I Ching, the Book of Changes. And depending on the romanization system, you might be familiar with this not as Y-I-J-I-N-G, but I-C-H-I-N-G. It's pronounced I Ching, however. The Book of Changes consists of a short text giving clues to the interpretation of the results of divination, in other words, fortune telling, followed by a number of appendices, or what are called wings, which elaborate upon the metaphysical significance of the interpretations. An I Ching interpretation is performed by making 6 binary decisions, a hexagram, and that's called casting the I Ching. These are written down as a stack of 6 solid or broken lines, what you see here on your screen. And this was traditionally done either by tossing yarrow stalks or tossing coins. So I'm not going to get any further into the weeds than that, except to say on this slide, I'll give you an example of what that first hexagram gives us. So if this was what you were working with, then the explanation of the separate lines is as follows. In the first or lowest 9, undivided, the dragon lies hidden. It's not the time for active doing. So now I'm just going to be reading the parts that are bold, because the stuff that's not bold is more complicated than we need to get into. So that first line means it's not the time for active doing. The next line means it will be advantageous to meet with a great man. The next is that the position something is dangerous, though there will be no mistake. The next one, it will be advantageous to meet with a great man. Then there will be occasion for repentance, and if the host of dragons appearing were to divest themselves of their heads, there would be good fortune. I love that one. That's a great one, the last one. So it's a little bit like reading your horoscope. I don't say that to be flippant, but you can see the parallels. If I were going to be really flippant, I'd say it's kind of like an ancient Chinese magic 8-ball. So if an important ruler were trying to make a decision, then this text would help interpret that fortune telling. So that's what the I Ching is. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is the Book of Documents. This work consists of a number of short announcements, councils, speeches, or similar oral reports said to have been made by the various rulers and their ministers from the times of Yao and Shun ancient China down to the early Zhou period. And we see here an example of the text. The next one is the Shijing, the Book of Poetry. Sometimes it's called the Book of Odes. The Book of Poetry is, as you might guess, an anthology of some 300 poems, dating mostly from the early Zhou period. The Li Ji is the record of rites. This text covers a range of subjects, from broad philosophical pronouncements to the most minute rules for the conduct of everyday life. And I really think this one, in a way, was one of the more influential ones on Japan, so I want to show you an example. So the text is tremendously short. The translation is much longer. So the question is, if a ruler dies and a son and heir is born immediately after, what course should be adopted? And Confucius replies, the high nobles, great officers, and other officers following the chief minister who takes charge of the government for the time should collect at the south of the western steps with their faces toward the north, and then the grand officer of prayer, in his court robes and cap, bearing in his hands a bundle of rolls of silk, will go up to the topmost step, and there, without ascending the hall, will order the wailing to cease. Mournfully clearing his voice 3 times, not twice, not 4th, but 4 times, 3 times, he will make announcement to the spirit of the deceased ruler, saying, "The son of such and such a lady has been born. I venture to announce the fact." He will then go up and place the silks on a stool on the east of the body in the coffin, wail, and descend. All the relatives of the deceased who are there, the high nobles, the great and other officers in the apartments, all will wail, but without the leaping. Without the leaping. When his burst of sorrow is over, they will return to their proper places and proceed forthwith to set forth the morning offerings to the dead. The minor minister will ascend and take away the bundle of silks. Wow, that's pretty specific. Now, let me say about my earlier comment that this was really tremendously influential in Japan. Not that the Japanese were taking this as a rule book, but what is influential is the importance of ritual. Here we have this amazingly detailed ritual, and it's all clearly spelled out about what to do in a particular situation. And if you've lived in Japan for any length of time, you probably understand how important daily ritual is in a way that is absolutely assumed within the culture. So I'll give you an example, and this might seem like a really far cry from the Confucian classics, but I think it illustrates my point. When I was an exchange student and living with a host family, I was doing some house cleaning, and I had a zokin. A zokin is a rag that's specially made for wiping up the floor, doing that kind of thing. And I was rinsing it out because I'd used it, and then I was wringing it out, and my host mother watched me do it. And I'm an American, I tend to be pretty pragmatic, so I rinsed it and then I wrang it. I didn't wring it in any particular way, I was just trying to get the water out. And she watched me and she said, "Is that the way Americans do it?" And I thought, what am I doing wrong? And she showed me, no, you need to fold it this way and then you wring it this way, and that's the proper way. And I was thinking to myself, as long as you get the water out, what does it matter? But it really mattered to my host mother that it be done properly. And I didn't say, "Why do you think that?" But I bet if I had, she would have simply replied, "Well, it's tradition. That's the way we always do things." And tradition and formality and ritual are all falling into that same category. The next book is The Spring and Autumn Annals. This is a chronicle of events in or affecting the state of Lu for the years from 722 to 481 BC. So those are the 5 classics. There are some additional classics. There's a commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals. There's another commentary on it, and yet another. And then there's a classic called The Ceremonies and Rites, The Rites of Zhou, the Analects, Mencius, the Classic of Filial Piety, Luxuriant and Refined Words. So these other texts were added over time to the list, and ultimately there ended up being 13 classics. But note that this list, in addition to the 5 we were just looking at, totals 14 titles, not 13. Yeah, I can do the math. This is because the Spring and Autumn Annals is printed with its commentaries, thus resulting in the 4 texts being combined into 13. Those 4 texts being combined into 3 texts of the 13 classics. Okay, so in addition to the 5 classics, we also have a grouping of books that is pretty standard, and that's called the 4 books. In the 12th century, Juxi, a Neo-Confucian, and I'm going to say more about that in just a minute, selected 4 texts from the classics and put them together as what he was going to call the 4 books, the Sushu. He believed that they constituted a better introduction to the complicated material in the classics overall. And so he created this set, if you will. He doesn't write them, but he puts them together in a set. We have the Great Learning, the Analects, Mencius, and the Doctrine of the Mean. So, for example, if you're in China, you can go to the bookstore and you can buy 1 volume that contains the 4 books. So let me cross over the water into Japan and say that early Confucianism in Japan is most evident in Prince Shotoku's 17-article constitution. You can find that 17-article constitution in translation along with commentary in a number of places, but probably the easiest place to find it is in, once again, sources of Japanese tradition. Here we have a picture of Shotoku on the right and a version of his 17-article constitution on the left. Most of those articles are really Confucian. A handful, a small number, are influenced by Buddhism, but really it's very much a Confucian text. So that's early Japan. We're talking about right at the beginning of what we think of as Japanese history, the importation of these Chinese traditions into Japan. Now I want to go forward a couple centuries and talk a little bit about Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism was let me back up one slide here. Neo-Confucianism is a later development of all the developments in Confucianism. The emergence of a more cosmological version in the 11th and 12th centuries is by far the most important, and that was this system, which we now call Neo-Confucianism, which was systemized by this scholar whose name is Zhu Xi. We see his portrait here. He lived 1130 to 1200. This so-called learning of the way has formed the basis of most Confucian philosophy since that time, since Zhu Xi's time. And this version of Confucianism is better known in the West as you see here. It's called Neo-Confucianism. Not really what the Chinese were calling it, but that's what scholars now call it. So if you're doing a search, library search, that's a term that you would use. And Neo-Confucianism was really central to Japanese thought. But there's a caveat. The Japanese were a little slow on the uptake with Neo-Confucianism. It took them a few centuries to really start paying attention to it. So whereas Zhu Xi is producing his important work in the late 12th century, that doesn't influence Japan until we get into the Tokugawa. But when we get into the Tokugawa, then the scholars really pick up on this and they go full throttle. There were a lot of prominent Neo-Confucian thinkers in the Tokugawa period. I'll introduce a handful to you here. There was Fujiwara Seika, Hayashi Razan, Yamazaki Ansai. He can be kind of entertaining to read because he's kind of out on the edge. Kaibara Ekken. Sometimes his name is pronounced Ekiken. Yamaga Soko, Ito Jinsai, and Ogyu Sorai. These were prominent scholars, and I presented them more or less in chronological order. Where can we find their work? Well, sources of the Japanese tradition, yes. So here is the table of contents that deals with that section. From sources of Japanese tradition, we see Fujiwara Seika, we see Hayashi Razan, Yamazaki Ansai. Sometimes they specifically mention Confucianism and the Confucian classics, and sometimes you have to sort of read through the actual piece to understand what the connection is. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned is this name Wang Yangming, which in Japanese is Oyome. It's not that Wang Yangming was not important, and you'll certainly read a little bit about Wang Yangming or the Oyome school in the Princeton Companion for today's learning module section. But I decided to leave it out in detail of this particular lecture because it seemed just enough on the edge of that greater category of tradition and religion. The next part of that table of contents looks like this. We have Yamaga Soko and the origins of Bushido. So Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, was also tremendously influential on Bushido, on the way of the warrior, which of course was the scaffolding upon which much of the Tokugawa was built. and it even sort of carries into the 20th century. We don't see it here on this page, but I would argue that some of what we see happening in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in Japan, although it's not called Neo-Confucianism, largely is. All right, so in a nutshell, that is this learning module on religion and tradition and philosophy. I'm sorry that we didn't have time for me to even summarize what these different philosophies or traditions hold, but that would have ended up being another hour. So my focus here was just to try and take you by the hand and give you an idea of what materials are out there and what is the most accessible for undergraduates.